anytime I've ever talked about this book, what I notice is if I'm talking to a group of people, I can see on their faces as soon as I start talking about this, there's something they bring to mind. All of us have a memory that in unguarded moments we return to.
Welcome to the Being Formed podcast. My name is Adam, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's guest, Casey Tygrett. Casey is an author and speaker, pastor, spiritual director, coach, and church consultant with over 25 years of experience working in the area of spiritual formation. Casey and his family live in the Chicago, Illinois area, where he serves as theologian in residence at Parkview Christian Church. Fun fact, Casey earned his master's and his DMin at Lincoln Christian Seminary in Lincoln, Illinois, which is the same Christian college where my dad met my mom back in the late 60s, early 70s. My brother and I, in fact, were born in Lincoln, Illinois. So if you're listening to this and you know anything about the restoration movement of Christian churches, it's a pretty awesome connection for me. This non-denominational movement of churches I grew up and served in throughout my entire time in ministry, it might be small compared to other denominations, but it's been my home, my extended family, my whole life. So that being said, I'm really grateful for Casey and the particularity of his call to ministry, both within the Big C church and within the context of his local church in Chicago. Casey's an author of several books, Becoming Curious, The Practice of Remembering, and The Gift of Restlessness. Today's conversation, we're going to talk specifically about The Practice of Remembering, which is a re-release of an earlier book entitled As I Recall. That book was awarded the 2020 Award of Merit in Spiritual Formation by Christianity Today. Everyone, I appreciate Casey's pastoral heart and tone, and I think you will too. Not only in his books, but also in his speaking and in his demeanor. So I hope that you feel like you're sitting right here at the table with us as you listen to our conversation. I don't know what you're doing. You might be working out, driving in your car, maybe you're at your desk, or maybe you're putting your feet up and savoring a good cup of coffee. Whatever you're doing, I hope you'll enjoy the grace and the peace in this present moment as God's Spirit tends to your one and only soul. Hey there, Casey. Thanks for joining the Being Formed podcast. It's great to have you on the show. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, friend. Thank you so much for the invite.
Good. Hey, I've been asking all our guests a similar question to that, but maybe just a little bit different. I'm going to ask you as well. How is it with your soul?
How is it with my soul? I think it's well, in the sense that I think we're all trying to grab a hold of what our souls are up to when we're not paying attention. Maybe that sounds like it gives a little too much credence and autonomy to our souls, but I tend to think of them as kind of wily, and they need to be paid attention to because our lives will get away from us. So I feel like as this year has begun, I'm a romantic, Enneagram 4, I like all that stuff. And there is something about the turning of a calendar page into a new year that feels like you have a chance to reclaim something, whether that's your disciplines or whether that's habits or whether that's just perspective, or claim some wisdom from the year that's gone on before that you can recall. So I feel like my soul is well because I'm looking at it and paying attention more so maybe than I was if we had done this, a few months ago. Maybe not as attentive, just because of life dynamics, things going on. So, long answer to a very succinct question, but I think things are well as far as I know.
Well, my soul is, I think, buoyed just by the conversation we've already had before I hit record, and just to hear your voice again, see your smile. Just for those who are listening, I had a chance to meet you, I don't know, man, maybe 3 years ago now at the Apprentice Gathering in Wichita.
Yeah, I think 3. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and at the time I was working with Grafted Life, and I was so happy to connect with you back then and realize that here's this spiritual director, author guy I know of who's actually a member of ESDA, the Spiritual Directors Association. And so, like, I was just thrilled to get to have a conversation over lunch with you back then. The real deal, pastor's heart, really open, present, gracious with your time and your heart. I just loved it. And ever since then, I've just enjoyed getting to occasionally be in circles that you're in. And so I'm eager to see where the Holy Spirit will take this conversation, trusting that it will be good for those who are listening. Because I think you're right. I think this is the time of year where people have an opportunity to, draw wisdom from the past and apply it into their journey, their transformational journey with God in the present and moving forward. That really is the subject of our conversation we're going to talk about today. Before we dive in, though, can you just give our listeners a bit of a biographical history? Like, man, where are you? Where do you live? What kind of work do you do? How'd you get there? What's exciting you right now in ministry and vocation?
So I've been in some form of pastoral ministry. I did this math the other day, and I don't like math, but I especially don't like math when it shows you your chronological age. I need to deal more with my aging than I have been, but I've been in some kind of pastoral role for the last almost 30 years. So whether that's students, children, young adults, I was a senior pastor of a small church for a while. I've been an associate pastor at some larger suburban churches, teaching pastors, taught in colleges and seminaries, both in the U.S. and overseas, and have been a spiritual director since 2015. And so right now, where you're catching me is, part of my time is my title is theologian in residence at a church in the Chicago suburbs. I do that. I see spiritual directees on the regular, affiliated with Soul Care, a great ministry. We've been tending to the souls of leaders for a long time. I've begun to do a little bit of church consulting in the areas of how churches approach and think about spiritual formation and discipleship. And I say begin, we're like toes, like pinky toe in the water of that kind of work, which has been good. And then I also do some work with couples with a premarital program at a local counseling center. And I'm working on a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling. And I am in the throes of launching a 17-year-old into college this coming fall. So it feels like that dance card is really full, like it's written on both sides. And so that's what's exciting to me. Is what's really exciting in ministry is actually, to me, just what's exciting in life. And that's seeing change and transformation in people, whether that's in the spiritual direction realm, just being able to see people, especially when it's transformation related to a narrative that's just a story that's been complicating a person's life with God. And one that is not, number one, not true. Number two, deeply, because it's untrue, deeply unhelpful. So whether that's through teaching or spiritual direction or even, raising my daughter, being able to see change, real change, the kind of change that you're like, this is going to take a minute. That kind of change has been really exciting. And being given the privilege, because it's not me. Like, it's not happening because I'm awesome. I don't get to see that because of any sort of like degree or anything like that. It's been because I've been given permission to sit in some transformational moments with people. And I always try to hold it that way. This is probably more than what you asked for, but I try to hold it that way with this sort of open-handed approach, knowing that I get to do this right now. So be present. And I've not always been good at that, Adam. I am way better at looking at either the past or the future. So being able to be present with it and let it be what it is, not try to manage it, not try to ask too many questions, but to say, Spirit, I'm with you and you are with me. So what is it that's happening right now? And how do I ruthlessly refuse to miss it? That's not always easy. and I do miss it, but that's been exciting, is just trying to stay in that place as much as I can.
Well, with a full dance card like you described, that seems like it'd be maybe even more challenging to be present to, the present moment, with as much going on as you have. What are some practices that especially help you remain present and open-handed and open and looking and being able to see what God's up to?
Yeah, some of them are new. Uh, Honestly, this year especially, I've brought a few new practices that are really geared towards knowing. The beginning of it is always knowing yourself.
Hmm.
When I work with premarital couples, I want to talk to them about where they might go off the rails. So I usually tell them, hey, look, three things: money, sex, and family. It's going to be either one of those or a couple of those combined. If you can pay attention to those now, you'll know what trips you up. And so even in spiritual practices, what I get frustrated about is that churches do not talk well about vision when it comes to spiritual formation.
Mm.
We jump right to what you do,
Yeah.
and we don't ever step back and say, what is Jesus inviting you to be? Like, what would it look like for you to look more like Jesus than you do right now? And who are you? You know, what would Jesus do if he were you? Dallas Willard. I can't believe we've made it this far in the episode and this is the first Dallas Willard quote. What would Jesus do if he were you, if he had your life?
Mm.
Well, that
Mm.
means assessing what is your life. And so for me, what is my life? And my life has been, I've struggled for most of my life with compulsive behaviors. So whether that's eating or, unhealthy use of the internet or doom scrolling, or, I'll find something and get wrapped up in it. It can be the healthiest thing in the world. I'll just overdo it. So really knowing and noticing how to cut off those compulsive behaviors. So some of the spiritual practices that have helped with that are things like fasting. It's allowed me, and this is not heroic, like I'm not doing 3 days and seeing visions and things. It's very simple and it's very flexible. But what it does is it helps me understand that if I can say no to this, then this overwhelming compulsion to eat, then I can say no to some of these other things. And the reason why that helps is because the compulsions become the distractions that keep us from staying present. So if I can engage those compulsions indirectly,
Hmm.
that helps me to do that. The other is keeping a significant kind of Sabbath rest. It's a big one. Our dear friend Mindy, and I don't know where she heard this, but Mindy Calaguire, she says rest is a weapon. She talks about
Mm.
that a lot. And I really appreciate that because it's hard to be egotistical when you take a day to remember that you're not in control of the
That's
world.
right. Yeah.
And that has been really helpful because it allows me to rest my brain, my body, so that when the day comes that I need to be present, and it's not easy. And I think that's the crucial bit, because there
Mm.
are days when it is easy to be present, as long as you just keep it in mind. It's the days when it's not.
Mm.
When you have a sinus infection, or when you're preoccupied because of a conversation you had with your kid or your spouse or a friend, and you're thinking about that instead of the person that's right across from you. So Sabbath allows me to renew and restore my brain and remind me who I am.
Mm.
I'm not there. I'm not in that conversation to change a person. We don't change people. So if I can remember that and know that I'm not in control of the world, I can easily just say, let's see what happens here. And there's some other small ones, if we want to get really deep and technical. I stopped taking and maybe this is too much information for your listeners, but it's going to be what it is. I stopped taking my phone to the bathroom with me.
That's
The
good. That's
amount
good.
of time, and distraction, even like some phones will give you that thing where it'll give you a weekly report of how much you've used it. And it was amazing just not taking it with me either to the bathroom or when I'm just sitting in the living
Right.
room with my wife in the evenings, just leaving it in my office
Mm-hmm.
and just doing the math on how much time I spent in the black mirror
Mm.
rather than with the person next to me, or
That's
just
right.
like
Yeah.
doing what I'm doing and then moving on.
Yeah.
That's huge. That has been hugely helpful. So
No, I know John Mark Comer. I remember hearing him talk about that very thing. Rule number one, just don't do that. And I think for me, I I've also really tried to adapt, and I'm good at this more than 50% of the time, usually. um, Not having my phone in the bedroom at night. So actually having a cord dedicated out in the living room somewhere where I can actually plug my phone in and leave it there drastically changes the way I wake up the next morning. Not so much how I go to sleep, because when I don't necessarily spend a lot of time at night looking at but man, first thing in the morning, if I grab my phone just to see what time it is, I'm off and running. And I would much rather be like Dallas Willard was when he would say the first things that he would do in the morning before he did anything else was say the Lord's Prayer and the 23rd Psalm as his feet hit the ground. That's who I would like to be. So even having my phone in another room.
yeah, and just the vision of that has been interesting. And I don't know if you experienced the same thing, but I noticed as I started putting up some boundaries and cutting off time with distractions, I just started doing it, and I decided January 6th, I'm going to start doing this. And so I started doing it. And so I did it for a week. So just depending on when people are listening to this, I'm 3.5 weeks in. So this is not like I've been doing it for years. But what I did notice was there were some moments where something happened that in November of 24, I would have reacted a certain way,
Mm.
and I didn't react that way.
Mm.
And I thought, well, that's why did, and then all I could draw it back to was, you are not as scattered, you are
Mm-hmm.
not as distracted, you are not as anxious.
Mm-hmm.
And so you didn't have to try. And this is the whole language. People who are in this spiritual formation conversation know exactly where I'm going. It's the whole language of working by indirection.
Mm-hmm.
I could try so hard to change that behavior with everything I had. And really all it took was me leaving my phone someplace else and not being constantly distracted. And all of a sudden, this behavior that I could have, gritted my teeth and clenched my fists and tried really hard not to respond the same way,
Mm-hmm.
I just stopped responding that way. And it's not perfect. Like, I still go back to it. It's a couple steps forward and a step back or so. But how gentle that was. It wasn't a massive life shift. I just needed to move this one thing. And so many pieces, like little Jenga pieces in my spirit, just kind of locked in. So
Curious. The conversation we're having is happening so freely, you and I, right now. And I love the fact that I can have this conversation with you. And I realize it's kind of been a hard fought conversation in the church. It hasn't really come that easily. I'm wondering, as we recall back to 10 years ago when you started this ministry to now, what's the shift been like for you to notice, whether it's your own context of your local church or the broader scope of your ministry? What's it been like for you to see more and more people kind of asking these questions and looking for a better life, a better way to live life with God, and acknowledging there is a deeper transformation that God is interested in us? Like, what's it been like for you to see that change?
it is wonderful to see that. The reason I pursued becoming spiritual director at all was I had come to a point in ministry. I was working at a fairly large church and was working way too much. The me who was doing that would have looked at the me talking about Sabbath rest and was like, that's a great idea. One day we'll get to that. And it had been about 4 years of a pretty high pace, and I really had come to the end of myself. And so Mindy Caliguire, I went to her as a friend and I said, here's where I'm at. She said, you should see a spiritual director. And I said, oh, okay. That sounds good. I like spiritual formation. You used the word spiritual. It sounds fantastic. And I didn't even investigate necessarily what that meant. She spoke a little on it, but she paired me with someone who had been a dear friend to her. And he lives 40 minutes from my house. So I drove to his house. We had one session for an hour, and I left and I wept for the entire 40 minutes back home.
Mm.
And I think it was just, it's not like he pronounced any magic, that shifted my whole life. He said very little. You know this as a director. He said very little. But it was just that experience of feeling like someone heard what I was saying and heard not only what I was saying, but the spirit and the soul behind it. And what I think has started to happen in the church that has brought this to the forefront is, number one, I think there's a friend of mine and I, he's an executive pastor. We always joke that spiritual formation needs a little better PR. Like the language just throws people off. But I think there's become a greater acceptance of that language. I think that churches have realized that rather than the soul just being something that needs saved, it's also something that needs to be tended, as if rescue is the end. Like we just haul you out of the ocean into the lifeboat, and then we're like, good luck. The soul has a need to be tended, to be cared for. And we realize, I think the other thing that we realize is that it's almost run parallel to the acceptance of mental health movements, counseling and therapy within the church. So we realize that there are ailments that can be attended to by prayer, that can be attended to by community and anointing and whatever moves your tradition, your theological tradition makes, that also can be helped greatly by talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, meds, and spiritual direction. And so allowing ourselves to remember that we are eternal beings alive in God's kingdom who are constantly evolving. Like our souls, our spirits and our souls are constantly changing because we constantly encounter new challenges. Like I just said about the me of 10 years ago talking about Sabbath, I look back at that guy and I was like, you're an idiot. You almost died. You almost went and sold cars. Not that would have been a bad thing. We need faithful followers of Jesus who sell cars. But you would have left for the wrong reasons because you did not tend to the one thing that Jesus said you can sell, trade, or give away, and you have that choice. And so I think that's the realization that the church has come to. There are now theological understandings of soul care, spiritual formation, and the other thing that I hate to even say, but it really bears to be said, is we realize that spiritual formation is an ecumenical thing. It's not just a Catholic thing. Granted, Roman Catholics have been writing and teaching on this for generations before the evangelical church. I always joke that like evangelical churches especially are late adopters. Like we'd just be getting around to the iPhone 8 right now. Because sometimes that's because there's a healthy skepticism, but sometimes it's for other reasons. And so I think we're finally coming around to saying this is not just a movement within a certain theological expression of Christianity. It is an expression of life for people who live with Jesus in the midst of nonsense.
It's an expression of life for people who live with Jesus in the midst of nonsense. Yeah, wow. So it's for everybody.
It's for everybody.
And we're picking up on it, thankfully. Well, you're an author, quite prolific, and we're going to talk today about the book that was most recently released, and it's actually a book that was written back in 2019. And the book was originally called As I Recall, and it won some awards, right? What was the award?
Yeah, the Christianity Today Award of Merit in Spiritual Formation in 2020. I didn't even know it was coming. A friend of mine sent me a text and said, "Congratulations." And I said, "For waking up, like, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to have some coffee now. Let's also mark that. Thank you very much."
Yeah. Yeah.
but a lovely surprise. Um,
Well, and then I don't know, something happened in 2020 that kind of put everything on the shelf.
that's what I hear.
So I think it's a great move, man. You re-released the book, and the new title is "The Practice of Remembering: Discovering the Place of Memories in Our Spiritual Formation." And I just want to, draw our attention to that. That I think that was re-released in 2023. You said.
Yeah.
Yeah, so here we go, man. I wanted to just dive in a bit with this idea of memory. And we've already touched on it, even just talking about you remembering yourself 10 years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you remembering yourself maybe 2 months ago. One of the things you say early on in the book is that we engage our memories in tandem with God because they are the starting points for who we are now and who we are to become. And I think, man, that just kind of almost as a premise of the book just really lands for me. Like, why think about the past? Why bring up memories that are painful? Whether they are, and we recognize some of the memories that we have are, you know, they're they're just memories, but others are painful, traumatic memories that we'd rather not go back and deal with. And yet we do this because they help us understand the stories we're telling ourselves or we're living in and out of. And then they help us in the transformational journey. So I just want to applaud you on saying that's why this conversation matters. Anything you want to just add to that?
No, you captured a great deal of it, and just listening to you talk about it. I mean, it's an odd thing to publish a book anyway. To re-release a book is an even stranger thing. But you talking about it reminds me of some of the things that were most important to me when I was writing it, and that are still important to me as a director, and important to the people that I talk to. I talk more in the book from a personal standpoint, how you singular experience memories. But obviously there's also an aspect where there's a we, plural, how we experience, what we remember. What I think is interesting is that personally we have very long memories. Corporately, we have very short memories. Personally, once we figure out how, we can tap into things that happened decades ago. As a corporation, as a group, whether that's a family or a church, a theological tradition, or even a country, we have very short memories.
You just touched on something that I'm noticing and struggling with is, the idea that when you have a polarized environment like we certainly have right now, two opposite sides of that environment can remember incidents two completely different ways. So the role that memory plays not just in our spiritual formation but in our cultural like understanding of the moment we're living in is is critical to recognize.
Yeah. I love to look at this through the lens of the gospel writers, and just taking a critical scholarship look at the gospels. And I remember reading a book in college where people who've gone to Bible college, they'll know this is a thing, but this class on Jesus, and we had a book called The Harmony of the Gospels.
I had
And it
that
takes
book.
it takes all the gospels and it like mushes it down so that they all line up. And I understand the teaching value of that. But I also go, but they're different for a reason.
Right.
And so you have interesting things that happen in the gospel writers' memories, or the community around the stories that they were telling, where Mark tells a story and it looks totally different. Well, everything in Mark is totally different. He's in an absolute panicked hurry, and he's okay to leave the end like the end of a Tarantino movie where you just feel depressed and sad and scared. Then you have Luke, who just wants to overturn every rock and tell you everything possible. And oh, by the way, there's this subtext about the poor, and the marginalized. So they're all telling the same story in some places about the same event, but they tell it different. In one case, it's James and John who come to Jesus and say, I want to sit at your right and your left. In the other case, it's their mom. Tell me there's not a social difference in why that story is told. So which is the right one? Well, these are how it's remembered. These are how it's remembered. And our memories are somewhat the same. There's a reason why when police or authorities are investigating a crime and they have 3 witnesses, they want all 3 testimonies, even though they might be different, because what they're doing is they're trying to triangulate something. And for us, it's the same with our memories. Our memories are seen from our perspective, with our story, with our place. If you experience something as a child, you do not experience that apart from your gender, your birth order, your physical, mental, and emotional status at the time, your relationship to either parent, if it's your parents who are involved, your socioeconomics. So once you start layering on top of that, it's no wonder that our siblings, we sit down together and you go, you remember that time the dad did this? And they were like, that's not how it happened. That's how you saw it happening.
Right.
And so there's a relativeness to it that's, I think, where we encounter God most, is because that's a place where we can learn. That's a place where we can be taught about the thing we're experiencing. And God can give us, can turn the gem and help us to see things a little bit differently. I know that that's part of, as I think about my parents, and a lot of this stuff happens. A lot of our memories that are challenging or painful do happen in childhood. Not all of them, but a lot of them do, at least some of the most formative ones. But I'll be honest with you. I look at some of my most painful moments with my family a lot differently now that I'm a father, and how things were handled and the things that were said. And at one point where I would have said, I can't believe you said that. Now I'm like, oh, I totally see how you said that now. Yeah, in stress, you say dumb stuff to your kids, and the real unfiltered version of you starts to slide out. So, yeah, how we recall things, not only from an emotional or spiritual, everything we do is spiritual, but if we want to use that category, how we recall them in a way that connects us to God, we recall them in a practical way, and then how we recall them in the context of our age and stage. And then you get into how all the brain chemistry stuff works and how all the neuroscience works. And it's just, I think it's finally something that we can look at that matches the complexity of who we are as eternal beings in God's unveiling kingdom.
We've used the language of soul already quite a bit, quite freely. Chapter 1, you're just building this whole premise here. We are at work in the renewal, care, and growth of our souls. We are at work. And we are at work with God. God is at work. The Spirit is at work with us. But we're bringing the stuff of our lives into this engagement with God, and hopefully into the formation of our becoming more and more like Jesus. But yeah, you use the language soul there. And so, Mr. Theologian in Residence, I feel like you're the right person to finally ask this question on the Being Formed podcast. What is the soul?
Soul, the word soul in the Old Testament is also translated as being or life or self. And so in the Psalms, it talks a lot about the soul as the whole of a person's existence. It also talks about the soul as a weaned child. It's one of my favorite, just such a moving psalm about our souls being with God with no need for God, weaned child with us. The soul is also the thing that seems to capture all of who we are. It is something in Jesus's perspective that can be traded, it can be lost, it can be given away, that we can barter for other things that we might see of value. Jesus says, come away with me. I'll help you learn how to take a real rest in Matthew 11:28. So it's something that can be rested. It's something that can be described as the whole of who we are. It's something that can be, as I said earlier, can be kind of wily, that we don't pay attention to. Our life, there's too many times when we look at people, other people, and from our perspective, we believe, I can't believe they let their life get out of control like that. And then when we're in the same spot, we don't say that. What we say is, how did it get here? Isn't that interesting? Like, wow, that person's a mess. I can't believe they let it happen. And then we're a mess. And we go, how did it happen like this? Is because the soul is the story operating in the background.
Mm-hmm.
It's the operating system on your computer that's always functioning. And it's the thing that holds us together. And because it's the thing that holds together the entirety of our life, this thing that can be traded, that can be given away, that is the whole of ourself, that we can love with, that we can live with, that we can work with, because it is the whole of all that, it is the thing that is most important to God.
Mm.
It is the most important thing about us. And it's the most important thing about our existence. And the best way to do that is to just introduce a little bit of bacteria, introduce a little bit of virus into our life, and see how that affects. And that's the other thing you asked earlier. What was the blessing of seeing spiritual formation start to take place, and spiritual direction start to take place in the church? One of the things I think has been of real value is the fact that we've recaptured the place of the body in spiritual formation. Because when I was in undergrad and I was studying to be a pastor, and I was reading I was taking Greek, Adam, I was deeply holy because I was suffering through Greek. And then I had no idea what Hebrew was going to be like, or else I would have saved some energy for that. I was doing all the things. And yet the life of prayer and engagement with God was very, very low. And part of that was because I ate terribly, I never exercised, and I never got enough sleep. And so the whole of my life, I could dedicate some of these parts, a lot of these parts, but there was this one part that was like introducing a virus.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started taking care of myself a little better, not like training to be an whatever, not the over-the-top view that we get on Instagram, but just like eat a vegetable, maybe go to bed a little early, and maybe, occasionally take a walk. Just small things. It was amazing how much more I was able to attend to my own life of others, and my life with God. And so the soul has this very layered, complex, complicated, unique way of putting us together and then connecting us with God. That's not a definition, but I think it may not be the map, but it's definitely the territory.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. And the reason I asked the question is because on this show, the Being Formed podcast, the premise is that we're always being formed by something all the time. And the question is, who or what is forming us, and what are we being formed into?
Yeah.
And it's all happening at a soul level. That I think I really want to stay in that space with all of our conversations about, you might think, hey, I can't see my soul, but I can see the work I produce. I can see the likes on Instagram. I can see the book deals. I can see whatever it is, right? But I can't see my soul. Well, at a soul level, though, that's where God is most interested at helping us to become the kind of people He made us to be. And He's at work doing that. The question is, are we going to participate with Him in that or not? Cooperate with Him in that or not?
And the role of distraction is big in that. The visible signs of who we are and how we make a difference. I took to talking a while back about, and this, for some people, this rankles. I hope it doesn't you, but and here's the preamble I'll give you. Is I love Celtic theology. I love the Celts because I think they bring so many answers to a lot of questions. Now, to be fair, pose a whole lot of other questions that we have no answers for, but they bring a lot of answers to a lot of questions. And one of the things is, historically, how the Celtic Christians not Celtic Christianity. Historians would say that's not such a thing, but Celtic Christians responded when Rome came and brought this doctrine of original sin to them on the island. And they basically, if I'm translating this down for tradition for contemporary hearers, they basically as a whole said, no, we're good, because they were very much beholden to the idea of original blessing. It's starting in Genesis 1, not Genesis 3. And I wonder sometimes how much ego battle we could let go of, how much validation we would need to see from other people, from our work, whatever, if we could return to the idea that everybody at the core is good and kind. We're just terrified. We're just terrified of being exposed. We're terrified of being wrong. We're terrified of not having enough of what we need. But to know that from the very beginning, you are God's very good creation, and that has never been revoked. Like, what does that do to the ego battle that we all get wrapped up in? And I think that's been happening a lot for me lately, because the wonderful thing about that is you either choose to pursue that path, or age will determine it for you. So the older you get, the more your body starts to go, no, that thing you used to do, not happening now.
Yeah.
You're going to be brought to that point of confronting that idea of like, what are you most terrified of? And will you be okay to know that you, even in your terror, you are God's very good creation, and you don't have to fight the ego fight anymore. That you can go at everything with open hands, that you can lose that job that you've wanted forever and ever and ever, and your soul will be perfectly fine. It's going to be terrible for a while, and it's going to be painful and challenging. Nobody said it won't. But what makes it worse is when we fight and flail as if that will save us from drowning. When if we would just release and let ourselves go into the float, we would be.
Yeah, the float. I'm reading this book right now, When the Well Runs Dry, Thomas Green, and literally the float. He gets to the point where he's saying it's about floating, man.
No kidding.
Yeah.
I'll have to read that.
Check it out. We're going to wrap this conversation up. I do want to end, though, with just what I think is a central metaphor throughout the book you use of gathering shells.
Yeah.
So you're talking about how, our memories are like shells, and some of them are beautiful and wonderful to pick up and behold, and others of them are really quite ragged and painful and have hard edges to them. But yet, our life is so much about integrating the memories that we have in their shells. And so we're going to gather these shells. And then what do we do with the shells once we have them? And in the very beginning of the book, you basically just offer a way to engage these memories one by one, just one shell at a time. Bring the shell, engage with the implications, and then look at what those implications have created. And I think in that you're really talking about how, in my life, I've got some shells, and some of them I don't like. And some of the implications of, some of those shells are the messages, the stories that I have chosen to live from because of those shells. But then the last movement is exploring how the Spirit of God is wooing and moving us through these particular memories and stories, because I think, to your point in the book, everything has a point, and if we will let it bring us to God and to God's transforming work in us. I would just love for you to wrap up our time unpacking just briefly this idea of engaging with these shells. I love the story you gave in the book. I don't know if you remember it, the moment where you received some feedback that wasn't good. I appreciate that honesty that you share in the book, but could you just walk us through this as a way of just pointing people, I think, to the work of practicing remembering?
Well, it begins, anytime I've ever talked about this book, what I notice is if I'm talking to a group of people I can see on their faces, as soon as I start talking about this, there's something they bring to mind. All of us have a memory that in unguarded moments we return to, that it haunts us, or it's just confusing. We've never really known what to do with it. So that's one level. The other level is some things that have happened that we remember, but what we don't know is how that affects us. So you brought that up earlier. Sometime after the book first came out, I think this will help. I started having this experience where I would leave the house and I would back out of our driveway and I would close the garage door. As I started to go where I was going, the thought would dawn on me, did I close the garage door? I don't know if I closed the garage door. So I would go back around the block. And then what I noticed was over time, I was 2, 3, 4 times back around the block. And just it became a moment where the 4th time I drove by, I thought, this is a thing. This is something. I developed little songs to remind myself that you closed the garage door, just little things to remind, and none of it was working. And so I started seeing a counselor, not for that necessarily, but we started talking about that. And in a session where we talked about that, something came up about responsibility. And what came to mind was a moment where I'd experienced sexual trauma as a child. Not from a family member, but from someone else outside of our family. And I, for so long, had taken responsibility for that it was my fault, and that it was my fault to protect and to keep safe. And what I didn't know at the time, but I do know now, is that PTSD has the potential to unleash symptoms that are like obsessive compulsive disorder, because you're trying to manage something that you couldn't manage in the past. And so as this wonderful, kind counselor guided me through all that, she talked about the idea of appropriate responsibility. There are things that are not yours to control, but what is yours to control? And what I found was it was easier to leave the house knowing that I had closed the garage door. And so I found myself in times later saying, God, that's a deep wound that I've carried for a long time, and it's having impacts on things that I do. Can you show me gently what else? What else is this having? And so I began to uncover all these places. So I just brought this memory of, and it wasn't because I read my own book and decided to develop this practice. It was because I started to see it happen in my life. And so I think there are a lot of people who read the book who notice they're carrying this thing, and it comes to mind so easily. And for them to just take some time with the Spirit, who's always with us when we're remembering things, and say, use your own language, but like, what is this thing doing? Not only how is it hindering me, or how is it corroding me? If it's a bad one, if it's a good one, how has this shaped me in good ways? But also, where am I not? What am I not seeing? And especially now, because neuroscientists are talking about how they're discovering it's not just your neurological pieces that remember things. They're seeing that actually cells and human tissue have the ability to recall things. Genetic code has the ability to recall, to form memories, and they don't understand it, which I love. I love to see people with 9 PhDs go, I don't know. It's a thing. And so just bringing those things to the presence, to the Spirit of God, and say, what in the world? And can you tell me how this has shaped me? And can you help me tell a different story about who I am, about reality, about what I'm here to do, and just experience freedom, sometimes experience reinforcement if you're discouraged. Just remember the time that you did this thing. And that's where the long memory comes really helpful for us individually. Just remember, you've been here before. You've been here before. And you faced this thing, and you're still alive. and I've been with you, and you're still very good at the core. So what do we do now?
Yeah, I love how you give practices at the end of the chapters. And one of the chapters you talk about journaling. And when I think about just what you were saying about even long term memory, journaling seems to be one of those practices that, I know the joke is Jesus didn't have a journal that we know of. I've heard John Ortberg say that, and everybody laughs.
Jesus
But
also didn't have a Bible, so let's be fair.
but I do see such value in the journaling piece. Um, Maybe not everybody's word driven. Maybe there's other ways to engage that ability to reconnect to God's faithfulness over our life. And so, I mean, is there anything about journaling that maybe you would just offer our listeners as a way that maybe they can practice remembering?
Yeah, in conversation, I've noticed that I think what freezes people up about journaling in general is just the openness of it. I've met people who are not opposed to journaling, but their big hangup is, I don't know what I would say.
Mm-hmm.
The people who navel gaze, they're not going to ask you whether they journal or not. They're just going to do it because we, and I include myself in that group, we love that. We love that
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing. It just makes sense. But people who are either on the fence or their personality doesn't lean towards journaling all that well, they're like, I'm not opposed to it. I don't think it's bad. What I'm challenged by is I don't know what to do with it. And so that's where I think this particular topic of memories can be really helpful, because I would invite somebody to say, take that core memory that I know has come to mind for you, that thing that you think about all the time, that moment from your childhood, or that moment from 10 years ago or whenever, and just write it out. Give as much detail to it as possible. Write it like you're envisioning it as a scene from a film, and you're giving directions to stage actors. What does it need to look like, smell like? What were you wearing? What was the weather like? And sometimes re-immersing ourselves. Now, if it's a super traumatic memory, I would ask, don't do this by yourself. Do this in the partnership with a therapist, someone who's trained in trauma response and things like that. Don't feel like you have to just up and do this, but immerse yourself back in that story. And especially if you're at another stage of life, you might look at that differently at 33 than you did at 23, or at 43 than you did at 33. So journal out that. And maybe it's not a regular journaling practice, but maybe you just occasionally come back to that and add a detail like, oh, I forgot Aunt Cindy was there, or I forgot I didn't say that. I actually said this, or talk to a family member and say, do you remember this? And then give yourself a full picture of it. And then just write a question. God, what do I need to pay attention to here? What did I miss? What did I miss? And I think that narrating a memory in a journal can be an incredibly powerful thing. You don't have to share it with anybody unless you want to, but just going through the act of doing it, putting yourself in that place, and then asking God to just be with you and to show you, what is it that I missed? What is it that you're teaching me?
Mm-hmm.
How has this made me who I am? And how is this affecting what I do with myself, with other people, even with you?
And God, what does freedom look like? If there's freedom to be found?
That's a good question, Adam.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom. How can people connect with you?
Yeah. Best way would be, I am rarely on many of the social medias, but I do look at Instagram quite a bit. So at KC Tygrett. Or I have a website where you can, if you want to reach out to me, there's ways to connect there. Also some resources of some things that I'm doing that you can take a look at. I think there's a link to the 3 books and other things there, but yeah, take a look there. And thank you. Thank you for being so gracious and inviting me into this space, and hospitable, and asking incredible questions, and doing the work you do. You as a spiritual director, there are people whose souls are being tended to every day because they have you as a guide. So Grateful for that.
Well, that's my prayer. Thank you, Casey. Thank you so much for being with us.
Glad to be here.
And once again, thank you, listener, for giving us some feedback on how these conversations are resonating with you, ways you're sharing them within the context of your community. And we just ask for more of that. If you'd be willing to help us. Our ministry is only 3 years old, and this podcast is really just a little over, well, in fact, it's not even a year old yet. We're coming up on a year of putting out these kinds of conversations with people like Casey, people like Dr. Barbara Peacock, Rebecca Ormord, my wife and co-founder of LifePoint Resources, and so many more conversations we've already had and are coming down the pike. So I hope that you will feel like this is part of your journey and you actually want to share this journey with other people in your life. So you can do that by rating this podcast show on your favorite podcast player, by leaving a review, by actually sharing it on your social media feed as well. And keep on letting us know how these conversations are impacting you and your walk with God. It really is our prayer. It's my prayer that these conversations are helping you pay attention to the ways God is tending your soul, both today and into this new year. God bless you. And until next time, grace and peace.